It began with a single memo that officially doesn't exist. In 1952, deep within the bureaucratic maze of Langley, a short internal report circulated between two departments that rarely spoke behavioral analysis and cultural operations. The subject line read, Archetypal Contagion and Symbolic Containment. Most memos from that era dealt with logistics, budgets, personnel, new surveillance tools, but this one was different. In its dry, typewritten paragraphs, intelligence officers spoke of symbols behaving like viruses, of ancient demonological diagrams reactivating in the public imagination, and of mythic imagery breaching the rational threshold of human consciousness. The memo referenced sources that had no business being in a CIA archive, Sumerian incantations, fragments of the Ars Goetia, even a handwritten note citing Jung's Red Book. Whoever compiled it seemed less like a strategist and more like a theologian with security clearance. The conclusion, redacted but partially reconstructed decades later, warned that certain images could trigger collective psychological states resembling group possession. It advised that archetypal material, demons, gods, resurrection symbols, should never be introduced into propaganda during moments of public instability. At first glance, it reads like Cold War superstition, but cross-reference it with the MKUltra archives and you find an unsettling pattern. A series of experiments not on individuals, but on societies, probing how mythic imagery could stir entire populations. The question that haunted later historians wasn't why the CIA studied such things. Intelligence has always chased influence. The real mystery was why they wrote about it like exorcists. When the memo resurfaced in declassified fragments during the 1990s, researchers noticed something chilling in its language, a fusion of technical jargon and occult taxonomy. Psychological contagion vectors, symbolic resonance matrices, archetypal hosts. It was bureaucratic demonology written in the calm prose of national security. No author's name survived the redactions, only an initial typed faintly in the margin. Whoever R was, they opened a door that decades of intelligence work have never quite managed to close. To understand why the CIA ever touched the occult, you have to understand the mood of 1949. The world had just survived one apocalypse and was quietly preparing for another. Nuclear fire was no longer a myth, it was physics. The Soviets had the bomb and the West had paranoia. Intelligence officials began to suspect that control of territory was no longer enough. The next war, they feared, would be fought inside the mind. Out of that fear grew projects with names that sounded like science fiction: Bluebird, Artichoke, MKUltra. Their goal wasn't merely interrogation, it was influence. Could you shape a person's beliefs? Could you implant an idea as if it were their own? At first, the scientists were psychologists and chemists. Then, increasingly, they were philosophers. People like Dr. Harold Rhine, who argued that the human psyche wasn't a fortress but a broadcasting tower, capable of transmission and reception across invisible fields. Rhine's writings caught the attention of a small CIA subcommittee tasked with cultural influence studies. He claimed that mythic symbols, especially those linked to fear, sin, and transcendence, could bypass rational resistance entirely. In his words, the demon is the metaphor that obeys. By the mid-1950s, the agency's analysts were exchanging papers on the intersection of Jungian archetypes and mass persuasion. They weren't studying demons in a theological sense, but as psychological technologies. If a demonic archetype represented a cluster of fears and desires embedded in every culture, then learning to activate it might influence millions without a single bullet fired. One internal report described propaganda as a ritual performed through image repetition. Another called cinema the new altar. The language was clinical, but the intent was mystical: control the symbol and you control the spell. It's here that the lines between science, myth, and manipulation begin to blur. The same techniques that once summoned gods and temples were now being studied under fluorescent light. The Cold War had become a war for consciousness itself, and somewhere in the archives, the memos began to sound less like strategy and more like invocation. When Carl Jung began writing about the collective unconscious, he was describing something vast and impersonal, a shared reservoir of images and instincts older than language. To the CIA analysts who encountered his work in the 1950s, it sounded like a psychological map of the supernatural. Jung wrote that the human psyche isn't a single voice but a choir, and sometimes one voice grows so dominant it consumes the rest. He called this possession by an archetype. The religious call it demonic influence. The intelligence community called it mass identification. In declassified notes from a 1956 behavioral studies seminar, one analyst summarized Jung's theory in chillingly simple terms. Archetypes are programmable mythic functions. Possession is narrative override. The team began comparing case studies not of exorcisms but of revolutions, how entire populations could shift from despair to zealotry seemingly overnight. The French Revolution, the rise of fascism, the American revival movements. They charted each like a contagion curve, looking for what Jung called archetypal activation events. One internal memo made an audacious claim that mass possession wasn't superstition, it was a social technology. A government, a church, or a movement could trigger archetypal energies the way a ritual priest once invoked gods. The analysts borrowed heavily from demonological language to describe these phenomena: the shadow aspect, the trickster current, the devouring mother, but in their hands these weren't beings, they were patterns, predictable, measurable, exploitable. To Jung, possession meant loss of self to a greater story. To the CIA, it meant opportunity. If you could identify the right archetype to awaken fear of the outsider, longing for redemption, hunger for purity, you could move an entire nation. A 1957 field note ends with a line underlined twice in red ink. We no longer summon spirits, we trigger symbols. The language had changed, but the practice had not. What shamans once called invocation, modern intelligence now called behavioral conditioning. The difference was only in the tools, not the intention. In 2003, a Freedom of Information Act release revealed something that scholars of the occult had suspected for decades: fragments of symbolic research buried deep in Cold War intelligence archives. Most of the files were mundane, reports on hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and communication intercepts, but mixed within them were diagrams that didn't belong in scientific documentation, circular seals reminiscent of Solomonic grimoires, triangular arrays labeled with terms like emotional resonance, subject alignment, and mythic polarity. One recovered chart was titled the Sigil System Phase 2. It depicted a network of shapes radiating from a central eye, the geometry oddly similar to both Enochian diagrams and the early logic models of computer networks. Handwritten notes in the margin read, "Symbols as circuitry, each design a behavioral circuit." To intelligence historians, this seemed absurd. To occult researchers, it looked familiar. The diagrams mirrored medieval systems of invocation, structures meant to focus collective attention until belief itself became an electrical force. Another memo referenced Operation Morning Star, a psychological experiment supposedly using religious symbols to test crowd persuasion. The name itself, Morning Star, was the biblical epithet for Lucifer, the light bringer. Whether intentional or coincidence, the imagery was telling. Across the declassified pages ran a quiet theme: that ancient sigils and modern logos shared the same architecture, symbolic compression of complex ideas into a single memorable image. Advertising firms called it branding. Intelligence officers called it cognitive anchoring. The scribes of Babylon called it magic. One field agent's report noted how certain emblems, introduced subtly into propaganda or art, could elicit measurable emotional reactions. "We are," he wrote, "rediscovering what the Magi knew, that a symbol repeated is a spell cast in slow motion." The deeper researchers dug, the clearer the pattern became. The Cold War wasn't only about weapons and espionage. It was also about control of meaning, about who decided which symbols guided the collective imagination of humanity. By the time these symbols surfaced in pop culture, from movie posters to national seals, the line between propaganda and invocation had already dissolved. Half a century after the first occult-tinged memos circulated through Langley, a new kind of magic emerged, one built not from ink and parchment but from code. The transition was subtle. Somewhere between the birth of the internet and the rise of social media, the same principles that once guided ritual magic began appearing in algorithmic form. Where the medieval sorcerer used sigils, compact symbols encoding desire, modern engineers built interfaces, icons that direct attention and emotion with mathematical precision. Today, every platform has its own set of digital sigils. The like icon, the retweet arrow, the notification bell, each one an invocation of reaction, engagement, or longing. Every click is a repetition of a small ritual feeding unseen entities of data and prediction. Researchers studying cognitive design have quietly noted what ancient priests would have called sympathetic magic, actions performed on symbols that change the unseen world. Tap a heart, and an algorithm somewhere rearranges 1,000 screens. Whisper a keyword and digital spirits recommendation engines awaken to serve it. In intelligence terms, this is behavioral conditioning through feedback loops. In occult terms, it's invocation through repetition. When CIA analysts of the 1950s wrote about archetypal contagion, they could not have imagined how completely the world would one day embody it. The collective unconscious is now measurable in metrics. The hive mind has become a data set. Consider the irony, those early memos warning against archetypal triggers now read like prophecies. The possession they feared wasn't demonic in a theological sense, it was algorithmic, a possession by pattern, not by spirit. Every timeline scroll becomes a ritual gesture, every trending topic, a mass summoning of emotion. The altar is no longer stone but screen, and the sigils are no longer hidden in grimoires, they glow in plain sight, pulsing red when you've been mentioned. What the ancients called invocation, we now call engagement. What the CIA called psychological contagion, Silicon Valley calls optimization. Different vocabulary, same spell. The digital age didn't abolish magic, it automated it. The word possession once meant a body overtaken by a spirit, something alien seizing the self. But in the language of psychology and philosophy, possession is subtler. It's the moment when your inner narrative stops belonging to you. For Jung, archetypal possession occurred when an ancient pattern seized the ego, when someone became the hero, the victim, the redeemer without realizing they were playing a script written long before their birth. To modern psychologists, it's the loss of metacognition, thought without awareness of thinking. To the intelligence community, possession became a metaphor for influence. If propaganda could make people act on a myth without knowing they'd adopted it, they were in effect possessed by narrative. Today, the term applies not to exorcisms but to algorithms. The line between belief and programming has thinned to translucence. When your feed predicts your reactions more accurately than your own reflection, who truly holds the steering wheel of thought? Possession, stripped of superstition, reveals itself as a philosophical question of agency. Who writes the story that lives inside you? When the stories you consume shape the stories you tell yourself, where do you end and they begin? In the 1960s, a declassified seminar transcript recorded a line from an unnamed analyst. Possession is merely externalized hypnosis. The demon is a metaphor for suggestion unrecognized. Yet across centuries, cultures have preserved rituals of exorcism not just to cast out evil, but to reclaim awareness, to remember oneself as something more than the voices that speak through us. In that sense, exorcism becomes philosophy. To notice the archetype speaking, the algorithm whispering, the propaganda scripting, and to pause, watching it instead of obeying. The ancients warned that the danger wasn't in being haunted, but in forgetting who the host is. That's the paradox of possession in every age, that the same forces capable of destruction are also the ones that, when integrated consciously, expand what it means to be human. By the late 1970s, the boundaries between intelligence research and mystical inquiry had blurred almost completely. Within certain CIA and defense intelligence circles, a quiet consensus emerged that studying the mind's limits inevitably led into metaphysical territory. It began with practical projects, remote viewing, telepathic transmission, the gateway experiments, but soon evolved into something else. Analysts who started as skeptics began borrowing vocabulary from Hermetic texts to describe data patterns they couldn't explain. They spoke of resonance fields, astral feedback, consciousness harmonics. A few of these thinkers proposed a radical theory, that the human psyche was not only receptive to archetypes but capable of generating them, that civilizations themselves birthed thought forms, collective entities made of attention and emotion. To study public consciousness, therefore, was to study living myths. The memos from that era read like a truce between two languages, one empirical, one esoteric. On one page, statistical tables. On the next, alchemical diagrams depicting transformation. Both attempted to map the same territory, the interface between imagination and reality. When Jung wrote that the gods have become diseases, he meant that humanity's forgotten symbols had turned inward, manifesting as neuroses. The intelligence researchers took the statement literally. If mythic patterns could emerge as psychic disturbances, perhaps understanding them could yield tools for both warfare and healing. In this strange convergence, the occult became a form of cognitive science. Demonology turned into depth psychology, invocation into behavioral priming. And yet within the jargon, a quiet reverence persisted, an awareness that knowledge of such power demanded restraint. One analyst's private diary, declassified decades later, captured the tension perfectly. We study the gods to guard against them, but sometimes I think the gods study us to remember what they are. Integration in this context meant acknowledgement that myth and reason were not enemies but reflections. Intelligence had peered into the abyss of the mind and discovered that it looked back, wearing the masks of angels and demons alike. In the 21st century, the rituals have changed, but the temples are everywhere. Each glowing screen, each fingertip on glass, repeats a gesture older than civilization itself, the invocation of unseen powers for knowledge, connection, or control. We kneel not before idols but interfaces. The hum of servers has replaced the chant of priests, and yet the structure is the same. Where once the ancients inscribed protective circles, today's coders write firewalls. Where mystics drew sigils to summon intelligences, developers train neural networks. Each line of code is a symbolic command, a spell cast in binary. Intelligence agencies were among the first to recognize this continuity. Internal white papers from the early 2000s marked behavioral forecasting operations, described the internet as a psychic field amplifier, a system that translates human attention into energy flows, measurable, manipulable, and in the right hands, weaponizable. Digital culture soon took on the same dynamics that ancient priesthoods once managed. Initiation through passwords, sacred texts as terms of service, and constant offerings of attention. Every click is a prayer whispered to an algorithmic oracle that predicts what you desire before you name it. If the Cold War's occult research hinted at the possession of the collective mind, our current digital era perfects it through convenience. The demons no longer knock, we invite them in with every login. Yet, as with the ancient mystery schools, this same machinery can awaken rather than enslave. Some technologists speak of digital mindfulness, of reclaiming attention as sacred resource. Awareness in this context becomes the modern exorcism. When the historian of the future looks back, they may not see a clear divide between ancient sorcery and artificial intelligence. They'll see a single lineage, humanity learning to conjure mirrors that think. The temple, the lab, the server farm, they are all architectures built for one purpose, to explore consciousness by reflecting it. In that reflection lies both our peril and our promise, proof that the oldest gods were never banished, only upgraded. Every generation rediscovers the same truth under new names, that the symbols we create eventually create us. The CIA's forays into psychic warfare and archetypal research were not isolated anomalies of a paranoid age. They were part of an ongoing human experiment, an attempt to map the invisible architecture of belief and emotion and to use it. From ancient conjurers drawing circles in ash, to Cold War analysts diagramming consciousness, to programmers scripting algorithms that anticipate our every impulse, all share a single instinct, the urge to decode the hidden language of the mind. But buried in every document, every ritual, and every line of code is a warning as old as myth itself. Influence without understanding becomes invocation without intention. The moment we forget that symbols live inside us, we become the instruments of the very forces we meant to study. Perhaps that's why the declassified memos read less like technical manuals and more like moral parables. They remind us that knowledge alone isn't wisdom, that every invocation, whether magical or digital, demands awareness of what it awakens in ourselves. Today, we stand at a new threshold. The algorithms whisper like oracles. The data flows like divine current. Each of us participates in the same experiment that began in those Cold War basements, shaping collective consciousness through patterns we barely perceive. But unlike those early architects of influence, we have access to their lessons. The first step toward freedom is recognition, to notice the archetypes that move through media, the patterns that shape thought, and to choose whether to follow them or not. Because in the end, the hidden project wasn't about demons, symbols, or spies. It was about awareness, about who becomes the architect of the stories that build our world. If you found value in this exploration and want to dive deeper into the declassified side of consciousness, myth, and intelligence, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, the most powerful sigil isn't drawn in ink or code, it's written in attention. Guard yours carefully.